At first glance, the Strait of Hormuz looks like a geopolitical landmine centering around oil. It's a 21-mile wide choke point that controls a massive percentage of the global energy supply. Warships move through narrow water, oil tankers line up single file, news anchors talk about sanctions and missile tests and military posturing, and oil prices spike in response. At first glance, this looks like a story all about geopolitics, about competing nations fighting over power, oil, and dignity. What if the real story behind this bottleneck started long before modern nations even existed, and instead was driven by a long history of humans connecting with a very precious body of water in unique and interesting ways? Today, we're looking at a story told over long periods of time, where humans have co-evolved with water in this region to create one of the most fragile bottlenecks the entire global supply chain has ever seen, where a single channel of water, just a few miles wide, now determines how mass amounts of oil and fertilizer move throughout the world. But also, as we'll learn in today's episode, it indirectly determines how life-sustaining water is possible for tens of millions of people, and how virtual water moves all over the world through the international food system. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow channel of water that connects the Persian Gulf to the west, with the Gulf of Oman, and to the Arabian Sea to the east. It's the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, which makes it one of the most strategically important choke points on the planet. The route that moves oil and natural gas from energy-producing nations of the Gulf out to the rest of the world. At its narrowest point, it's only 21 miles across, such that deepwater navigation of tens of thousands of ships per year is compressed into only 2 primary shipping lanes, each only about 2 miles wide. Before the current conflict, a massive portion of the world's liquefied natural gas and seaborne traded oil passed through this strait annually. It is essential for energy supply throughout Europe and Asia and other regions, and it also serves as a primary shipping route for a critical share of the world's seaborne urea, the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer on Earth. The single bottleneck anchors global pricing and logistics for the international food supply chain. So, how did social relations with this tiny stretch of water end up shaping the entire Middle East and subsequently the entire world? I am a socio-hydrologist, scholar, and engineer, and I study the ways in which humans and water have co-evolved together across long stretches of time to better understand some of our modern-day problems and solutions around water. And in today's video, I want to peel back the layers of the Strait of Hormuz crisis in a way that you may not hear from the mainstream news, but that will help you better make sense of how we all got here and why both humans and water are key to unraveling this mystery. To understand the situation we're in today, we have to first go back around 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age. Back then, the Persian Gulf did not even exist, and it was instead a massive river valley fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, because so much water was locked up in the glaciers. The land currently sitting under the Gulf was exposed as a massive, flat, fertile basin roughly the size of Great Britain. And the Strait of Hormuz itself was a dry canyon, acting as a gate between the edge of this fertile valley and the open ocean. Some archaeologists have proposed that this exposed dry basin may have acted as a refuge for very early human populations during the Ice Age, providing year-round access to fresh water and fertile land in an otherwise harsh climate. But as the Ice Age ended and glaciers all over the world started melting, sea levels rose, eventually pushing through what we now know of as the Strait of Hormuz and forming the Persian Gulf. And scholars believe that as the basin flooded, the people living there may have been pushed outward in a massive, slow migration, which some argue could be the missing link behind the sudden appearance of settlements around this new shoreline that showed up in the archaeological record with remarkably sophisticated early civilizations in their establishment, They had advanced levels of architecture, complex water management, urban planning, craft, and trade. In fact, this mass migration from the Central Basin outward is what some theorize may have formed the basis of what we now know today as the Great Flood stories, told across various religious and mythological traditions, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Mesopotamia, the story of Noah in the Judeo-Christian Bible, and the story of Nuh in the Quran. And there are accounts as recent as the 17th century suggesting that this flood memory was sustained beyond written story and lived on within oral tradition and local knowledge. In 1603, a Portuguese traveler passed through the Strait of Hormuz and documented a first-hand account of speaking with local divers who collected fresh drinking water from a set of ancient springs underneath the seafloor and selling this water in the open market. According to local tradition of the time, these springs had been used for thousands of years already as a primary source of fresh water, but were known to have existed long ago, far inland before the Great Flood. Meaning, the people here were still connected with the local hydrology based on ancient knowledge about the water and storytelling that had been passed down for centuries, and which the modern people were using to survive. I tell you this part of the story because if these theories hold up to be true, that some of the earliest human communities sprang up under what is now the Persian Gulf, and then later expanded outward due to a far-reaching and permanent flood, it would mean that the stories we still tell today were originally written down because they had a profound impact on the people living through that time. And as we'll explore next in the video, that relationship with water has continued to shape major human decisions around settlement, survival, and cultural connection in a way that helps to shine light on maybe just why the Strait of Hormuz crisis is affecting so many people around the world. But not everyone in this ancient story experienced water the same way after the basin flooded and the strait had been formed. You see, as the basin flooded, people began expanding outward in two primary directions. One to the northwest into the river delta of mostly present-day Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates were still actively running with abundant surface water, and the other to the northeast into mostly modern-day Iran, which was much more arid than the Tigris-Euphrates basin because the Zagros mountain range here acts as a massive high-altitude rain barrier for the region. The mountains catch atmospheric precipitation before it can reach the plateau beyond, and much of that water is infiltrated into massive aquifer networks under the surface of the land. And so here, for the communities that had settled in the more arid regions with little surface water, in order to survive, they had to somehow reach the fresh water hidden under the land. They constructed revolutionary underground aqueducts called Qanats that transported groundwater from the mountain aquifers out into the dry plains using only gravity. This ingenious system minimized evaporation losses and helped to sustain major city development and widespread agriculture for millennia. These Qanats were so impressive that UNESCO now protects 11 of them across Iran as a designated World Heritage System. Even more so, the Qanats that originated here were so effective, the idea eventually spread across the ancient world, including throughout North Africa, Spain, and into the Americas, as a way to provide sustainable drinking water in arid regions using gravity alone and in accordance with local precipitation patterns. By relying on the underground water table being replenished by natural rainfall, the survival of people who relied on Qanats was bounded by this natural water cycle, meaning settlements could only grow as big as the regional rainfall would sustain. And for thousands of years, these Qanats provided a remarkably sustainable water supply where groundwater recharge remained in balance with local extraction. However, in the mid-20th century, the system began to collapse as modern and highly technological engineering allowed for the drilling of deeper and deeper wells using diesel and electric engines, which in contrast to these original gravity-fed systems, could be pumped much faster than the local hydrology could naturally replenish. And at the same time, the 20th century saw a massive oil boom across the region, on both sides of the Gulf, which helped to fund the transition from primarily relying on local hydrological patterns to provide water to being able to circumvent local water constraints and translate this new oil wealth into potable water through novel technologies. Oil wealth funded a transition from scarce groundwater and seasonal river systems to mass desalination plants all along the coast, giving rise to modern megacities like Dubai and Doha. And on the Iranian side, oil money paid for a very different water technology where the government subsidized the drilling of hundreds of thousands of deep motorized wells for farming. This massive surge in pumping, combined with the gradual abandonment of the communal maintenance system for Qanats that had for a very long time been used to make the system function sustainably. All of this pulled the water table down below the ancient Qanat tunnel systems, leaving many of them completely depleted today. And although these technologies differed, both paths represented the same transition, moving away from living within the natural water cycle limits towards trying to engineer our way out of them, at least temporarily. Essentially, desert civilizations realized that they could bypass the natural water cycle by extracting oil, trading it with the rest of the world, and using the proceeds to power either massive desalination plants or oil-subsidized pumping up of the ancient groundwater. Both options would provide clean water to the residents without being limited by the slow natural recharge rate of local hydrology. And in doing so, the capacity for development was no longer constrained by the slow drip of local rainfall and percolation, but instead by the artificial system of trading oil, which originally took tens of millions of years to form from ancient sea life, and now is being traded into the revenue needed to convert that same seawater into drinking water. And as I'm sure you can see where I'm headed with this, such a system is only sustainable as long as the oil continues to flow, both out of the ground and throughout the world, via this tiny maritime channel where massive cargo ships go in and out of. And at least right now, that part of the system is stuck behind a massive bottleneck that is choking everything to a near grinding halt. And this doesn't just impact the desert cities that have relied on oil money to survive, it impacts all of us, as I'm sure you can feel, even beyond the price of gasoline in the car. It impacts us through, yes, you guessed it, water and our connection to water as humans. Because the rest of the world made a similar trade between our local hydrology and oil. This allowed for our overall economic and developmental growth. Because as the Gulf states were transitioning to desalination plants and massive water wells, the rest of us were also transitioning how we related to our own local water cycles. This is because before the mid-20th century, agriculture across the world, meaning how much food we can grow and what kind of food, was generally bounded by local water patterns. Food tended to grow where the rain fell, or where a river could be diverted over reasonable distances to make up the difference. But now, with the advent of oil and gas, we were able to create a highly industrialized and interconnected system of global agriculture. Instead, we can now grow food all over the world where the rain fell and transport it wherever we wanted, essentially disconnecting the water that is originally used to grow the food from the person or people consuming the food. Scientists call this the virtual water trade, meaning every shipment of grain or food on these big cargo ships around the world is really a shipment of all the underlying water it took to grow that food, moving invisibly around the planet. For example, the Middle East and North Africa, they import massive quantities of wheat every year, and if they grew that wheat locally, it would require a volume of water similar to the entire Nile. This could be likened to the Ogallala Aquifer in the American Great Plains that has been steadily drained for decades to grow very water-intensive crops, and we export this water virtually across the country and the world via food. In the 20th century, we also learned to make synthetic fertilizers using natural gas. And today, a huge percentage of the global population is fed by crops grown with these synthetic fertilizers. A significant portion of the global food supply now travels across international borders before it ever reaches anyone's plate. We rely on a constant loop of massive cargo ships and oil-driven fertilization to create our sustenance. So basically, water is moving all over the world all of the time through massive human-made systems, and not just through the natural hydrology of how water originally developed to move. So we're no longer relying on local water patterns to make our major decisions about how we develop over time, where we live, how big we get, how we grow food. But we have a very globalized water system where a single small piece of hydrology can have far-reaching impacts on the overall world. So we have this disconnect between people and water at two scales, both locally in a land where humans had learned to live with their local water patterns for millennia, where they worked with local constraints and challenges that nature provided, but have now transitioned to relying on more novel forms of water unlocked by fossil energy. And the other scale is globally, where an entire world has gotten used to eating food from the grocery store grown with water that could have originated thousands of miles away, disconnecting the people from the water needed to eat and survive. And this disconnect can go on for many years and decades until a crisis arises, like the one we're all seeing today in the Strait of Hormuz, and it stops everything in its tracks. You see, the strait didn't become important just because it is narrow. It became important because over time, humanity tied more and more of its identity and survival to this tiny stretch of water and what passes through it. Thousands of years ago, when the Gulf originally flooded, our ancestors were forced to flee. They remembered that event in their oldest myths because they understood a fundamental truth, that water dictates how we live. Moreover, these ancient civilizations also were bounded by their local water constraints. They knew that how fast the underground water aquifers could replenish determined how fast they could grow. But recently, we seem to have forgotten this lesson that local hydrology had been teaching us for millennia. We think we have bypassed the rules by trading fossil fuels for engineered water systems and globalized food. We get so caught up in drawing political borders and fighting over them, convinced that our empires are built on the land beneath our feet. But in the grand scheme of things, civilizations are built around water. And when we try to stand on top of that natural process and force our own resolutions, we may end up with an entangled mess that, with just one external trigger, can choke the whole system into oblivion. So in essence, water, not us, has the ultimate say in how we evolve, and we need to learn to adapt and listen to it. Thank you.